Let us now step into ancient times, into the kingdoms of the Middle East. Let us behold the imposing figure of Naaman, a name that resonated with power and respect. He was no ordinary man, but the supreme commander of the Syrian king's army. A feared war leader, whose victorious campaigns ensured the security and expansion of his kingdom. His position was one of highest influence, a man the monarch himself trusted, surrounded by honors and privileges. But human fragility and divine sovereignty can shake even the strongest foundations. A silent tragedy, relentless, invaded the life of this powerful general. He contracted leprosy. What a terrible word leprosy was in those days. Synonym for despair and doom. There was no known cure by physicians, no potions, no rituals that could halt the advance of this devastating illness. It manifested on the skin, spreading slowly, consuming the patient's body in a visible and repulsive manner. But the physical suffering was only one part of the ordeal. Leprosy was extremely contagious, leading to mandatory isolation. Lepers were separated from their families, from their communities, forced to live on the fringes of society, as outcasts. For Naaman, the proud general, this was more than a disease. It was the imminent loss of everything: his brilliant military career, his position of honor and command. Everything was at risk. His family, his friends, the social life he knew, would be snatched away from him. Leprosy meant the loss of his dignity, his influence, and eventually, his very life. Imagine the anguish and despair of such a powerful man, accustomed to solving problems by force or strategy, confronted with an invisible and incurable enemy, for which his military strength and elevated social status offered absolutely no solution. Leprosy was an insurmountable wall, an abyss opening up beneath his feet, threatening to swallow everything he was and possessed. The shadow of death and isolation hovered over the once invincible Naaman, leaving him in a state of unimaginable vulnerability and despair. How could such a man, with the world at his feet, find a way out of this darkness that enveloped him? Amidst the shadow of the leprosy-consuming Naaman, a ray of hope shone where it was least expected. In the house of the powerful general, a young servant girl, captive from the land of Israel, kept an unwavering faith in her heart. Even far from her homeland, and in servitude, she did not lose hope in the God of her fathers. She knew, with a certainty that came from afar, that in Samaria lived a man of God, a prophet, whose name was Elisha, and this young girl, with a courage that surpassed her fear, dared to speak. She told her mistress, Naaman's wife, that if her master could go to Israel, that prophet could cleanse him of his terrible disease. A simple declaration from the mouth of a slave girl, but one that carried within it the promise of an impossible miracle. This unlikely news, this spark of hope, traveled through Naaman's house. From the servant to the mistress, from the mistress to the afflicted general, and from the general, it reached the ears of the king of Syria, a king who saw his most valuable commander being consumed by illness. The king heard the story of the young captive, the mention of the prophet in Israel, and he decided to act. He did not hesitate to seek this cure, even in enemy territory. Thus, the Syrian king prepared an entourage. He wrote a letter to the king of Israel, asking for his help so that the prophet Elisha could heal Naaman. It was a chance, however small. A door opened amidst the darkness of the disease. Naaman, the respected general, now embarked on a different journey, not for war, but in search of healing, in search of life. He left Syria with great pomp, taking rich gifts with him: silver, gold, fine clothing, all that his power could offer in exchange for hope. An imposing entourage accompanied him, horses and chariots, worthy of his high position. But inside, what did he feel? Despair, hope, humiliation. Going to ask for help from a prophet of a people his army oppressed. It was an unlikely quest, based on the word of a young slave girl. But for a man on the brink of the abyss, any ray of light is a path to follow. And so Naaman traveled to Israel, taking with him not just gifts and power, but the fragile hope of a single word, the word of a young captive girl. And so the great Naaman, the feared commander, arrived in the land of Israel, bringing with him not only rich gifts but the heavy burden of his illness and a fragile hope. His arrival, so imposing with horses and chariots and numerous retinue, caused a great commotion. The king of Israel, upon receiving the letter from the Syrian monarch, tore his robes in despair. What kind of request was that? To cure leprosy? Was he God, with power over life and death? Wouldn't this be a pretext, a stratagem to start a conflict, a war that Israel did not want? The king's heart filled with dread and confusion. However, the news reached the ears of the prophet Elisha, the man of God, and Elisha, with the authority that came from the Most High, sent for Naaman. Naaman went to the prophet's house, perhaps expecting a reception befitting his status, a formal meeting with the man who could perform the miracle. But the scene that unfolded was unexpected. Naaman arrived at the door with all his pomp and circumstance, and the prophet Elisha did not come out. There was no handshake, no direct look, not even a respectful greeting. Instead, Elisha sent a messenger, a simple messenger with an instruction. The order was clear, and in its simplicity, shocking to the Syrian general. Go and wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River. Your skin will be restored, and you will be cleansed. Imagine Naaman's perplexity. He, the mighty Naaman, had come seeking something grand, an imposing ritual, perhaps the prophet's laying on of hands, a dramatic invocation to the heavens. He expected the prophet to come out, stand before him, and perform something visible, something that matched the magnitude of his problem and the dignity of his position. But only a messenger came, with such a mundane instruction, and to make matters worse, washing in the Jordan, that muddy and insignificant river, compared to the majestic rivers of Damascus, the Abana and the Pharpar, whose waters he considered clear and superior. Why not wash in those rivers, which he valued so much? Indignation seized his soul. His pride was wounded by the prophet's apparent lack of respect, by the simplicity of the order, by the choice of that mediocre river. How could something so simple, so devoid of pomp or visible power, cure an incurable disease? Full of anger and disappointment, Naaman turned his back. Determined, he began to leave, rejecting the only hope that had been presented to him. While fury consumed Naaman, and his chariots moved away from Elisha's house, a group approached with calm, yet firm words. They were his own servants, those who faithfully accompanied him and witnessed his affliction. They questioned him, with a wisdom that came from loyalty, and perhaps from the reverent awe they themselves felt for the situation. "My lord," they said, "if the prophet had ordered something great, something difficult to endure, to prove your faith or your strength, wouldn't you have done it without hesitation, without questioning the difficulty? Why then, if he asks for something so simple, something that even seems insignificant in its apparent humility, just to wash yourself in a river, why wouldn't you try that?" Imagine the powerful general, accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, stopped in his tracks by leprosy, and now confronted not by a king or enemy army, but by the reasonable voices of his own servants. The words, imbued with simple logic and a touch of compassion for their master's desperate situation, pierced the armor of Naaman's wounded pride. He stopped in his furious retreat, the heat of rage gradually subsiding, giving way to deep reflection on the small, but, perhaps only, hope that remained for him. And there, in that crucial moment of forced humility, the proud Syrian commander decided to yield. He decided to set aside his initial contempt for the Jordan River, that insignificant muddy trickle compared to the majestic rivers of Damascus, Abana and Pharpar. He headed to the Jordan, the entire retinue watching in expectant silence, an unlikely spectacle of power yielding to simplicity. Naaman descended to the bank, and with an act of faith, or perhaps submissive desperation, plunged into the waters. Once, the still visibly leprous body emerging, he plunged again. Twice, the disease still covered his skin. He continued, obeying the prophet's simple and precise order. 3, 4, 5, 6. With each dip, hope might have wavered in the face of the lack of immediate change. But the decision to obey propelled him to continue, to complete the indicated number. And then, the 7th dip. He rose from the waters for the last time, and what his eyes saw, and what his skin felt, was something that defied all human understanding and expectation. The leprosy, the incurable disease that consumed him, had completely disappeared, leaving no trace. His skin was restored, clean, healthy, as pure and soft as the tender skin of a newborn child. There was no longer any sign of the devastating illness. Obedience to an apparently humbling instruction, in a river he despised, had unleashed the miraculous power of God, a power that human medicine failed to offer, and military power was utterly useless to obtain. Simple obedience, an act of faith that sprang from the words of his servants and the prophet's command, brought the healing that would transform not only his body, but his entire perspective on life. The powerful general, once plagued by leprosy, now returned to the house of the prophet Elisha. But he wasn't just coming to give thanks for a healed body. Something much deeper had happened. His hardened heart, his mind turned towards foreign gods, all had been transformed by divine intervention. The physical healing was merely the gateway to an even greater healing, that of the soul. There, before the man who was the instrument of God's grace, Naaman made a declaration that would shake his own world. With a conviction born of the miraculous experience, he proclaimed, "Now I know, truly I know, that there is no God anywhere on earth, except in Israel." What power this confession held, coming from a Syrian commander, a leader of enemy armies. It was a public acknowledgement of the sovereignty of the God of Israel, above all other gods and earthly powers. In his immense gratitude, Naaman wished to honor Elisha. He offered him treasures, glittering gold, solid silver, sumptuous garments, riches fit for a king. But Elisha, the humble prophet, firmly refused. He would not accept payment. Why? To make it clear that Naaman's healing was not human work, nor a service that could be bought. It was a pure act of God's grace. Divine power is priceless. This refusal reinforced the lesson for Naaman. God's salvation and blessings are gifts, not bargains. Then, with his new heart full of reverence, Naaman made a peculiar request, a request that revealed the depth of his new faith. He asked to take home, to Syria, a quantity of earth from Israel, sacred earth, enough to be carried by 2 mules. His intention, to build an altar in his own land and upon this holy ground offer sacrifices solely to the God of Israel. It was a powerful symbol of his renunciation of the gods of his homeland and his exclusive loyalty to the Lord. He understood, however, the complexities of his position. As general to the king of Syria, he would have to accompany his sovereign in religious ceremonies. He would have to bow in the temple of Rimmon out of official duty, not out of belief. And with moving humility, he asked God for forgiveness in advance for these ceremonial acts, showing that, despite outward appearances, his heart belonged only to the God of Israel. Thus, the Syrian enemy, the despised leper, returned, home healed in body and converted in soul. A true miracle of God's grace. What a remarkable transformation for a man who sought only physical healing. The story of Naaman, the Syrian general, echoes through the centuries with lessons that resonate deeply in our souls. It reveals to us, first and foremost, the magnitude of divine grace, a grace that extends beyond borders, reaching even an enemy of God's chosen people. Naaman, in his desperate search, had to confront his own enmity and yield his monumental pride. This humiliation, this willingness to cry out for help, even coming from where he least expected it, was the gateway to the blessing he yearned for. How often do pride or bitterness prevent us from seeking celestial aid, from surrendering to the source of all healing and forgiveness. Humility and sincere crying out, "Behold the path to receiving the undeserved gifts from above." But there is more to learn from his journey to the waters of the Jordan. The prophet's instruction to wash 7 times in a river he considered inferior to those in his homeland seemed, at first glance, illogical, even outrageous for a man of his stature. Yet, Naaman's obedience, despite his doubts and initial reluctance, was the channel for the miracle. It was not the water itself, nor the number 7 as a magic ritual, but the act of obedience by faith in the words spoken by God's messenger that triggered the divine healing. This teaches us to trust and follow God's directions even when they seem too simple, strange, or challenge our limited logic. Faith manifests in obedience, and blessing follows obedient faith, and Naaman's final transformation far surpassed the physical healing. Yes, his skin was restored, clean like that of a child, a visible and undeniable miracle. But the most profound change occurred within him, in his spirit. He did not return home merely purified from leprosy. He returned, transformed into a believer, recognizing the sovereignty of the one true God, the God of Israel. This is the supreme lesson. The conversion of the heart is the most significant miracle we can experience. However wonderful the healings, the provisions, or any other earthly blessings may be, they are temporary compared to eternity. The salvation of the soul, the genuine faith that connects us to the Creator, that is the true and lasting wealth. Naaman reminds us that, in the end, the most important journey is the one that leads us from impurity to holiness, from enmity to sonship, from pride to humility, and above all, from the sickness of the soul to the faith that heals forever. And so, we reach the end of another journey through the sacred scriptures. If this message has touched your heart and enlightened your understanding, we ask that you leave your like, your comment, and, above all, that you subscribe to support our project of carrying the word forward. May the peace of the Lord be with you, and may God richly bless your life.